God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it of. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above, and the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof. With lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. And behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh wherein is the breath of life from under heaven. And everything that is in the earth shall die.
I think people don't believe in the flood today because they don't have access to the accurate information and evidences that are there. They are simply captive to entertainment, social media. There you have movies like Noah that in a very fictional and nonsensical way distorts the Bible totally. And for many people, that's the only source they have for something they think is a biblical account. We have, of course, a whole embedded presupposition of evolution and the geologic column and all of these things which tell students as they come along that the earth has existed for millions, if not billions of years, that man is a product simply of natural succession. A flood is a supernatural event. A flood is a divine judgment. A flood destroyed mankind. And they're not told that there are evidences of these things. They aren't shown the historicity of Genesis to say that this holds up very well in terms of our scientific age. So it's simply, on the one hand, a lack of information, and then on the other hand,
the fear of man. For the same reason that they don't believe in a lot of the things that the Bible says are literally true, literally history and literally science, the fear of looking silly and the intimidation by people who host science television shows and wear white lab coats. I think it's really that they're afraid of appearing silly in any way. But when you actually go past the surface and look at the feasibility of it and the historicity of it, it's almost inescapably plausible.
Conventional scientists, the secular scientists, think that the present is the key to the past. The Bible, in fact, tells us that the past is the key to the present. And the flood is key to understanding why the world is the way it is today, not just the geology, but even the humanity. Understanding the ark and the flood is very relevant to understanding why the world is the way it is today, how we got to be here. Everyone is interested in their history, and the flood is key to understanding our roots.
In the early 19th century, when the idea of millions of years was developed, it developed as a result of a conscious rejection of the flood and the biblical chronology. Most of the church came to the conclusion that the flood wasn't global, it wasn't really geologically significant, the age of the earth doesn't matter. And so over the next 100, 150 years, the flood was just kind of forgotten. And it still, in large measure today, is ignored by most Christians. They just never think of it and its relationship to the question of the age of the earth, but it's critically important.
We can go back and we can see in the fossil record, for example, what happened.
When we look at the world around us, when we look at all of those hundreds and hundreds of rock layers, they're sedimentary layers. That means they were laid down by water. The flood is a reminder that God judges sin, and God said he's going to judge the world again.
He sent the flood to punish evil at that time, and that's why God sent the flood. It's important to punish evil. That's justice.
What is just? The reason the ark is so amazingly relevant in the flood is because man's sin deserves judgment.
The Bible clearly reveals that we are now approaching the time when the second global judgment will come. If we don't understand or believe in the first global judgment, then we will not be ready for the final global judgment. So the consequences of the next judgment could not possibly be more relevant. What is at stake is heaven or hell.
The Holy Bible, a book inspired and architected by God and written by His people, dating back to the beginning of real human history, from the time of man's true origins. A book that teaches us that the earth is not millions of years old, as we've been brought up to believe. A book teaching us that we did not come from monkeys or apes or primordial soup, but a book that instead shows us our Creator is a loving, merciful, and just God. A God who created a beautiful world in which the entire planet was once a paradise. A paradise that He gave to us to fill up and multiply across. In Genesis, we're shown that God had finished all of creation in 6 literal days, and that indeed everything He had created was very, very good. In the span of 4 days, God was finished with the heavens and the earth. And it was on the 5th day that He began making the sea creatures, both great and small. And on that very same day, He also made all of the exotic flying creatures, which flew through the open firmament of the beautiful heaven. On the 6th day, He made all of the majestic land creatures, which included all of the dinosaurs, along with mankind. He also planted a garden, and in the midst of it, the tree of life. But there was another tree God had also placed in the garden, one that God commanded man not to eat from. Sadly, mankind used their free will to sin against their holy and righteous God. With free will comes consequences, and in this case, the consequences of sin would plunge mankind into darkness.
Before the fall, God saw everything that He had made, and it was very good. Tov Ma'od. It was just the way it should have been. It came forth exactly as He intended.
At the end of Genesis 1, it says it was very good. God looked at everything He had made, and it was very good. And we get some idea of how good it was in the last 3 verses when God says that both man and the animals and birds were vegetarian. They didn't eat each other. They ate the plants and the fruit of the plants. That's telling us a lot about how very good the world was.
Creation was in a state of innocence. This affirms a fundamental element of God's character. He is good. God is not the author of evil or death.
God came into the garden. He had fellowship with man, and they could actually communicate with Him and see Him. According to the way we understand the pre-fall condition,
They would have lived forever. God warned him beforehand, if you eat from this, you're going to die. Well, Adam did eat. God told Adam, you're going to die.
God said, from dust you came, and to dust you shall return. So that's physical death. Through one man, sin entered the world, and death through sin. Adam and Eve began to die physically. The fall of man affected the whole creation. The ground was cursed. The whole creation is groaning in bondage to corruption.
Sadly, the reality of the fall is now easily seen wherever we look. In this broken world, we see pervasive death, violence, corruption, lies, hate, and sin.
that is what has happened to the world. And so it describes entropy, the whole idea that things are subject to decay, dissolution, finally death. The whole world is like this. It has a limited shelf life, so to speak.
It changed the world profoundly. Pretty much everything was corrupted. The human soul, even the creatures were suddenly carnivorous or poisonous. Diseases and viruses emerged that were otherwise benign. It just radically changed everything. It even changed plants. Plants suddenly became weeds and choked out the crops.
The ground was cursed. Thorns and thistles began to grow. We don't live in the original very good creation. We live in a fallen creation, a cursed creation. The fall was a massive, catastrophic, world-changing event.
So everything was corrupted. It was a tragedy on the highest possible level. Evil had to mature before God unleashed the first judgment.
The Lord God had made a beautiful world in which everything was once very good. But when the first man broke God's command, man's domain was plunged into sin and death, which only grew worse with the progression of time. And it was not just man who had been corrupted. Animals became carnivores and turned on each other and man. Where once the earth had been filled with God's goodness, now was filled with the celebration of evil and endless violence. Paradise, along with man's innocence, was now gone.
Most flood geologists point out that the world, the earth, had a more global, warm, mild climate. And the evolutionists believe that too. It's not just because of continental drift that we find pine tree, forest, and dinosaur fossils on Antarctica. Not just because those continents were once in different places, but because the earth had a warmer, milder, global climate, heavier, lusher vegetation, greener, thicker forest that stretched further towards the poles and away from the equatorial zones. Right now, we just don't have the kinds of forests that could generate the coal deposits that we have, or provided the vast source for the carbon that would have been necessary for the coal seams that we have today. We would have had to have had a lusher, warmer, more forested, more vegetated Earth.
We have many creatures in the fossil record that are just like today, but that were much larger. So giantism in the fossil record, that indicates that the pre-flood world was much more suitable for biological life.
Originally, at least, it wouldn't have had impassable mountain ranges. It wouldn't have had huge desert areas. God created the world to be inhabited. Prior to the flood, mankind had wrecked their environment to a large degree. The Bible talks about the wickedness of man. In Genesis 6, it speaks of every thought of man's heart was only evil continually, and that the whole world was filled with violence because of man. To me, I think it would be a very frightful place to live.
Noah and his family, they found grace in God's sight. Apparently they were not of those that were corrupted, and God took that remnant of mankind, was able to preserve it.
But one of the things people find interesting is the lifespans of humans before the flood. Noah was 600 years old, and after he got off the ark, he lived 350 more years. He was 950 years old when he died. Now, his sons that got off the ark didn't live that long themselves, but they lived into their 500s. And then the next generation, the 400s, the 300s, we are getting to Terah, Abraham's father, living into his 200s. Abraham lived to be 175. And it was an exponential decay in the lifespans.
Adam and Eve had no mutations. The first 10 patriarchs before the flood had very low mutation rates. And so they were all living to be about the same age. Something happened at the time of the flood. And that's when this incredible degeneration of humanity happened. There was this incredible decline in longevity. When you plot the data, it's astounding, because the data, which is straight out of the Bible, and you wouldn't expect scientific data in the Bible, but the data follows a strict decay curve, and it's stunning.
In the Bible, we are told that before the flood, men lived to be nearly 1,000 years old. The average age of men at the time was so staggeringly high compared to today that some have a difficult time comprehending how such longevity was even possible. Yet, a major clue lies within the ages given to us in the book of Genesis. In almost computer-like fashion, the book of Genesis reveals that the post-flood lifespans of the genealogical line of Adam follow a mathematical concept known as exponential decay, meaning that if you were to graph the lifespans of all of the men after the flood, you don't see a linear line gradually sloping down, as you would likely see if the ages were made up, but instead, what you see is an exponentially decaying curve with minor variations, since no two people are alike. Would the men who recorded these ages through history really have conspired together to create data that follows an exponential decay curve? Instead, what we see resembles exactly the type of data we would expect in the aftermath of a worldwide flood, revealing a steep initial drop-off of lifespans just after the flood due to the catastrophic environmental changes. No more access to nutrient-dense foods from the world that was lost, and genetic mutations that were not before present. The truth is that no one at the time of recording these metrics would even think to plot them in an exponential decay curve if they were making up fiction. This sophisticated decay curve is actually the result of a real and easily provable flood event.
The objections to Noah's flood are mostly ridicule and laugh out louds. The only serious things are maybe trying to say, well, where did the water go? Where did the water come from? And then lampooning Noah's Ark.
When I was a master's student at Ohio State University, I looked at the geometry of the cross-section and of the length of just the straightforward reading of the Bible. And I found out that it's dynamically stable 90 degrees in pitch mode and 90 degrees in yaw mode. Meaning it'll go all the way up to 90 degrees and it'll come back. It's stable.
Not that that wouldn't have caused problems for the people and the animals in the ark if it had been tilted that much, but that does show the stability. Certainly whatever they could have taken in the turbulence, the ark could have taken structurally.
This is a 200 scale ark, and I put it in my swimming pool, and we put a measurement device on here that was 1 inch, and so we were able to scale the waves. And do you know that it scaled to 500-foot waves, and it was still stable, never turned over. 500 foot. A tsunami, by the way, is about 100 feet. So it lets you know about the dynamic stability there.
Most of biology didn't need to be on the ark. Most plants didn't need to be on the ark. Most insects didn't need to be on the ark. Only the creatures that have breath in their lungs.
Most of the species live in the ocean, which do just fine in a flood. So the Bible doesn't say that Noah was to take 2 of every species onto the ark. It was to take 2 of every kind. The same word that's used in Genesis 1 that talks about God creating different kinds of plants and animals to reproduce after their kind. And so we think there were maybe only about 1,400 kinds and about 7,000 animals on the ark. Average size, maybe a large sheep or a small cow, but most creatures much smaller than that. We're not talking about, for example, 2 Great Danes, 2 German Shepherds, 2 wolves, 2 coyotes. He took 2 of the dog kind on the ark. And we know from modern genetics that there's tremendous genetic variation built into the DNA for each kind of creature.
Evolutionists often claim that it would not be possible to fit all of the species of life on Earth onto a ship the size of the Ark, even when factoring just how humongous Noah's Ark actually was. At roughly 50 feet high, 85 feet wide, and more than 500 feet long, the Ark is the largest wooden vessel known to have been built by man, with the USS Wyoming, a gigantic wooden schooner built in 1909, coming in at second at 450 feet long. Yet, regardless of size, imagining how the Ark could fit 18 million species of all life on Earth is a rather elementary level way of understanding the excellent efficiency of the Ark's economy. The reality is that the sea creatures, insects, invertebrates, and plant species did not need to be included on the Ark. You see, God instructed Noah to only bring the vertebrate land animals, and when you simplify those animals to their genealogical class structure found in Genesis, which is known as a kind, you can further significantly reduce the number of animal kinds needed down to around roughly 1,400 kinds, or approximately 6,750 animals in total. Of those animals, you also don't need to bring fully mature adults, when smaller juveniles would fit better, eat less, waste less, and live longer while reproducing in the post-flood world. With roughly 6,750 animals on board the ark, we can now also estimate that approximately 1,400 cages were needed. And when considering that only 20% of the ark's volume was needed for food storage, you can see that we have plenty of room left over for cages and infrastructure, with the remaining area able to fit the equivalent of 483 semi-trailers within its volume. It's also no surprise that the dimensions God gave for the ark turned out to be optimal for stability. In fact, if we were to scale the ark up, it appears that modern cruise ships have taken notes from the ark's dimensions, as you can see striking similarities in shapes and proportions that they share. As you can observe, the influences of the ark are alive and well today, and have long-reaching implications in virtually every field of science, including baraminology, botany, hydrodynamics. But as compelling as the science behind the ark is, we must not forget that it is God who orchestrated the events. It was God who decided the time to judge the world had come. And it was God who was ultimately responsible for the deliverance of all who were aboard the ark. In the second book of Peter, we are told that in the last days, before Jesus Christ returns, people would deliberately ignore the evidence of the flood. Or as the Bible puts it, they would be willingly ignorant of the flood. Peter tells us that in the last days, men would mock the Bible and the second coming of Jesus Christ, and instead, they would walk after their own lusts, just like they did in Noah's day. You see, just as Noah had faith to carry out God's command to build the ark, and just as Noah had faith that God would bring them through the flood, so we too must have faith that God was perfectly capable of preserving Noah, his family, and all of the creatures aboard the ark. Is it too difficult a thing for the God who created the universe and everything in it to preserve the life that he chooses? Of course not. So let us not be counted among those who Peter prophesied would ignore the evidence of the flood, since we are indeed living near the end. Instead, let us be named among those who believe in God and His Word. The Bible says that on the day that the rains of the flood began, all of the animals with the breath of life were on board the ark with Noah and his family. And it was God himself who would shut them all in and save them from the coming judgment.
The global nature of the flood is given in the biblical text, and it's quite clear, especially going to the original terms that are used. The term for the flood itself is Mabul.
The unique Hebrew word, Mabul, it's used only one other place in the Old Testament. That is in Psalm 29, verse 10, where it says that God sat as king at the flood.
It's a very unique term that sets this account apart from other types of flood.
So this was a unique flood. First, we could talk about the flood itself, the purpose of the flood. Contrary to what many think, it was not simply to destroy sinful man, but also, Genesis 6 tells us, to destroy all the land animals and birds, not in the ark with Noah, and to destroy the surface of the earth. And only a global flood would accomplish that purpose. Then we can talk about the ark. The purpose of the ark was not to save a few animals so Noah could start a farm after the flood. It was, as Genesis 7:3 says, to keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth. And then we have the repetition of universal terms.
Everything that is under the whole heaven, under the whole earth, everything in which is the breath of life.
Those words appear 60 times in Genesis 6. All, every, under heaven. And when you have a repetition of those words, that is emphatic. Secondly, we have the duration of the flood, 370 days.
Why such an extensive flood if it was only local? I mean, why that duration of the flood? Why it takes so long for it to recede and dry up?
There's no way a local flood could last that long. We have the depth of the flood. It covered all the high mountains, everywhere under the heavens. And since water seeks a level plain, it would have to be a global flood.
When the scripture says that the waters rose to about 24 feet above the mountains, even if you give the idea that the mountains were not as high as they are now, they were upthrust after the flood, you still have water only rising to its own level. If we had a local flood, then obviously there's no need to build an ark.
If the flood was local in the Middle East, the ark was totally unnecessary. The animals didn't need to go in there. And he could have told Noah and his family to go on a vacation to Europe or Egypt.
Noah and his family could have walked to a safer place. And then why an ark at all? Why such a large ark? Why all the animals? Why the birds? The birds could fly away. Animals, there are animals in other places after all, if it's a local flood. Just this whole idea of everything included in the ark, two of each kind, means you were trying to preserve all of life at that point.
Only a global flood fits the purpose of the ark. Then we could talk about the volume. It was way too big if it was just a local flood.
You also have the very theological concept that if you had men elsewhere who were not part of the judgment of the flood, then the whole idea of a judgment on mankind for corruption of the earth would make no sense whatsoever. God says, I've seen the wickedness of man that's great on the earth, not just in one local place, but on the earth. When we come to the New Testament, you have a passage like 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 through 7. It compares a flood that destroyed the world that was with a future judgment on a coming world, or the world that now is. If you had a local judgment in the past, you'd have to have a local judgment in the future. But of course, this is the second coming of Jesus Christ to judge his world, and it has to be universal.
Well, if the flood was just a local event, then what do you think? Maybe when Jesus returns, just a local event? No, it's going to be a worldwide judgment as well.
The Bible tells us that God looked upon his creation, and behold, it was all corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Judgment Day had finally come.
Where did all the water come from for the flood? I mean, where did it come from and where did it go? Well, look at the globe. We're 3/4 covered with water 2 miles deep now. It's all still here.
The most asked questions are, where did the water come from for the flood and where did it go? And the answer is easily explained in the model of catastrophic plate tectonics.
The process of catastrophic plate tectonics is very similar to conventional plate tectonics. The main difference is the speed or the rate at which these processes unfold. Today, the plates are moving about a few inches per year. However, during the flood, 1 billion times faster. When the flood began, it began with these fountains on the bottom of the deep ocean.
Where the Bible even says the fountains of the great deep were opened up. The mid-ocean ridge is 44,000 miles long. Most of it is underwater. That's why they call it the mid-ocean ridge. And if it all erupted at the same time, it would have made the ocean floor do this. Wow. And then the mid-ocean ridge would have erupted all around the world at the same time, roughly. But that first phase, would have caused sea level to rise a mile, plow. Then this tidal wave coming out from that sudden rise at the ocean floor in the middle headed towards the continents. Now, that would have been the phase one of the flood. The second phase of the flood, it says, was when the windows of heaven were open.
It's no accident that there's an order given there in the scriptures. The fountains of the deep broke open, that is the crust breaking open, the water shooting up, the supersonic steam jets, and carrying that ocean water up, then it fell as global torrential rainfall.
People all know the flood was 40 days and 40 nights of rain, but the waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days.
When the fountains of the great deep broke open, as the Bible describes, that's the description of the fracturing of the pre-flood crust. You've got molten material that's expanding as it solidifies. The new ocean floor expanded. That pushed up sea level. That means that the ocean floor is actually going to rise. The ocean waters rose up to cover the continents. The new ocean floor cooled and it shrank, and therefore sea level fell and the ocean waters drained off. The flood waters are still present on the Earth's surface today. They went into the new ocean basins that were produced as a consequence of the flood. In fact, the Earth is still 70% covered in water.
Yeah, the water's still here. It's deep in those trenches. Some of the trenches are 8. Now we find out 10 miles deep. If we had lower land formations and a higher ocean floor, we would probably be a water planet today with no land surface. And it's scraping the bottom of the barrel to try to say, where did all the water go? It's still here, and it's very easy to explain that the same water, mostly the same water that's here, would have been adequate to have flooded the earth at one time, and that the situation has changed. That water is now in deeper basins. Not a problem in the flood model at all.
We're all familiar with the theory about Pangea, which holds that the continents were once connected to form a supercontinent that later broke apart through a process called plate tectonics. Catastrophic plate tectonics is essentially the same idea as conventional plate tectonics, except that the timeline and events are all centered around the year of the flood instead of millions of years of slow processes. You may be surprised to learn that it was a man named Abraham Ortelius, a famous cartographer from the 1500s, who first proposed the idea that the flood of Noah may have been responsible for tearing apart the Americas from Europe and Africa. Hundreds of years later, another Christian by the name of Antonio Snider Pellegrini would first theorize the modern concept of continental drift, in which he illustrated 2 maps depicting the continents of the world as once joined together. This was decades before German geologist Alfred Wegener would propose his own version of the theory, known today as Pangea, and be erroneously dubbed the father of continental drift. Antonio was snubbed of this honorary title. His crime was citing the book of Genesis, in which he said he made the discovery that at the beginning of creation, there was only one continent. You see, the book of Genesis laid out exactly what happened to the earth in the past during the flood, starting with what the Bible calls the fountains of the great deep opening. It wouldn't be until the 1950s that technology initially developed to detect submarines underwater would stumble across these gigantic scars from the fountains of the great deep that had split open, exactly as the Bible had described. How did a book, thousands of years old, know exactly what was at the bottom of the ocean floor? The Bible says that first, these giant subterranean rifts broke open, piercing the earth's crust, spewing magma that created steam jets that shot up into the sky. Then the book of Genesis says that the waters poured down as torrential rain through the windows of heaven that were opened up, and that the rain lasted 40 days and 40 nights. The supercontinent that the book of Genesis described is now beginning to break apart. At first, the newly partitioned continents oscillate, slamming into each other before starting their ultimate journey of separation. This closes seaways and forms volcanoes and mountains in the Americas and Europe, such as the Appalachian and Caledonian ranges. The seafloor spreads, forming from molten magma, widening the separation between the new continents. Scientists will later discover that the seafloor at the mid-Atlantic ridge is much younger than the seafloor in other parts of the world, exactly as the Bible suggests. As this newly emerging volcanic floor spreads, it subducts under the west coast of North America, binding and releasing, causing massive tsunamis carrying mud mixed with sea creatures, totally overwhelming the land. As what's known as the conjugate Shatsky rise pushes up during the subduction, the Rocky Mountains also begin to form, along with the Independence Dyke Swarm, a 400-mile-long volcanic region that billows ash that covers half of America. As the western interior seaway emerges during this time, the last of the dinosaurs are flooded, mixed together with sea life, and are buried in mud, sand, and ash in the middle of America. As we near the end of the flood, activity begins to cease as the seafloor stops spreading and begins to cool. As the new massive ocean floors cool and retract, the waters reverse back down into the new ocean basins and recede as much as a mile. All over the earth, trillions of fossils are left behind as incredible evidence of the worldwide catastrophic flood.
The most compelling evidence for a global flood is the sediment record itself. All over the earth, what's under your feet, hundreds of distinct horizontal layers, generally with smooth interfaces between the layers. The only way that such a record could have come into existence is global scale processes producing the whole record in a single global event.
All over the world, the layers are flat and there's no river channels in them. Think about what you see at the Grand Canyon. You see these flat pancakes, one on top of another, just flat, 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 flat. They're basically erosionless. Here's how they formed. At the beginning of the flood, there was movements of the crust. Crustal movements actually cause earthquakes. Earthquakes in water cause tsunamis. The tsunamis then originating from the ocean areas would then race across the continents. Once the tsunami lost its power, the sediment would settle down out of the water and form a flat layer at the bottom. That's the first layer. Then another earthquake in a different part of the world sets off a tsunami, maybe a week later, maybe a day later, brings in a different sediment. The tsunami runs out of power in this area. The sediments in the water settle to the bottom and form another flat layer. There's no erosion. Again, you have a third tsunami bringing in these sediments, third layer.
My simulations indicate that these tsunamis were large enough for a single tsunami to sweep all the way across a continent.
These layers were formed underwater. That's why they were so confusing to so many people. It's fascinating to see the evolution scientists explain their dig sites. For example, at Dinosaur Provincial Park, they have 10,000 dinosaurs buried in this flat layer. And you ask the site paleontologist, well, how did these 10,000 dinosaurs get in this flat layer? Well, they died in a river in flood. Oh, what was the shape of the river bottom? It was a flat river bottom. So you're saying this river that was so strong that could bury 10,000 dinosaurs over 5 miles wide, which would be a raging river, wasn't strong enough to cause an erosion channel? Why isn't there a river cut from this river channel? Why isn't there erosion from that river? The answers make no sense in light of this flat problem, the erosionless problem.
What we see at the Grand Canyon is that the layers got bent at the edge of the plateau. Because the folding was smooth when the sediments were still soft, the whole sequence had to be formed rapidly during the flood and then bent at the end of the flood while they were still wet. And so
These folds are very strategic evidence tying together all the layers, and it emphatically demonstrates that the millions of years never happened.
Or the fact that you have what are called polystrate fossils. They're usually trees that go through more than one layer.
These trees have 3 layers that are supposedly 30 million years worth of rock around them. You know that if you start accumulating sediment around the bottom, the sediment would eat away at the bark would rot, and the tree would die even sooner, would fall over even less than 100 years. But here we have trees, vertical, fossilized with 3 layers. In the worldwide flood, trees were swept up and they were floating on the top. Now eventually the trees became waterlogged and sank to the bottom. Now trees normally sink horizontal, but some trees, as discovered by Dr. Steve Austin, when they sink vertically. If a tsunami wave comes, and there was a lot of tsunami waves during the flood, and brings in sediment, when the tsunami wave loses power, the sediment in the wave settles into a flat layer at the bottom. Maybe a week later or a day later, another tsunami wave comes in from a different direction. When the tsunami wave loses its power, the sediment begins to fall, and now it forms a second layer on top of the first, amongst this vertical tree that hasn't fossilized yet. Now, if that tree could be buried with 30 feet of sediment in just, say, a week, you could easily accumulate the entire Grand Canyon stacked layers in a year's time. It is the explanation that defeats the evolution time, and it actually defeats the theory of evolution. This is the single most important geological fact, and nobody seems to teach us in college or in the evolution world.
Evolutionists claim that the Earth is millions of years old, and one of their so-called proofs are stratified rock layers found within the geologic column. Evolutionists teach that each layer represents millions of years of rock formation based upon their uniformitarian view that says you can make assumptions about the past based upon processes today. But in doing so, you're assuming that there were no catastrophic events like a global flood. Evolutionists also ignore the flood evidence contained within these rock layers, like sea creatures mixed together with land creatures. Just ask any coal miner. Anywhere on Earth they dig, they find countless sea creatures embedded in the rock. You see, the Bible refutes evolution theory, stating that it has only been roughly 6,000 years since the beginning of creation, giving the true account of how the sedimentary layers formed, as sedimentary rock is rock that is formed in water, which is also incredible testimony of a worldwide flood, given that the Earth's surface is made up mostly of water-formed sedimentary rock layers. The fact that the layers were actually formed in water also explains why there is no erosion found in between the layers, as there would be if the layers took millions of years to form. Then there's the issue of bended and folded rock, which could only occur if the layers were pliable and soft at the time of the bending, which is exactly what a global flood would cause. The bent layers also prove that their formation was rapid, with multiple layers forming rapidly on top of each other, because the bottom layers would still have to be saturated with water and didn't have enough time to dry out. As forces acted upon the layers, they bent in unison from top to bottom. Claiming these layers folded together over millions of years while still forming cannot explain what geologists are observing. Only underwater rapid burial could explain these phenomena, remembering that sedimentary rock layers, of which these are formed in water in the first place. To further prove that these rock layers were formed quickly and in the flood is the fact that in countless places around the world we find polystrate trees. Poly meaning many, and straight referring to the multiple layers that these trees are running through. If you understand anything about how organic matter decomposes, you'll know that it's impossible for trees to remain intact for millions of years while layers of dirt and debris slowly pile around them, and rain and moisture rot the wood out. Instead, what the evidence shows is that trees were swept up in the flood and carried off, and as they became more waterlogged, they sank. Some trees would sink uniformly, while other trees contained more water saturation in what was left of their bottom roots. These trees would be bottom heavy and float down to the floor, but rest upright. Tsunami waves would carry in sediments that would bury the trees quickly in multiple layers. In fact, geologists discovered that the same sand from the eastern side of America had been carried in tsunami waves all the way to the west side of the continent. This explains how the rock layers contained fossils of sea creatures mixed in with land plants. And it also explains why the trees are missing their root systems, and most importantly, why the trees are found running straight through multiple rock layers that evolutionists are claiming are millions of years old. Let's also not forget that some of these layers are the size of continents, indicating that these trees and rocks were laid down in a single and catastrophic event, and not local floods at different times. Today, we assume that fossils are a normal part of the cycle of life, since we see so many of them all over the world. Yet fossilization is not what we observe at all when something dies today. Thankfully, dead matter does not fossilize today under normal conditions, but instead, God made dead matter to break down and return to the earth. The fact that we see so many fossils indicates that there was a worldwide event that caused mass fossilization of all life on Earth at one point in time. Think about it. If the Earth today is covered 71% in water, water-formed sedimentary rock layers made up most of the rock on Earth. Inside those rock layers are sea creatures mixed in with land creatures. Some of these sedimentary layers span entire continents, meaning they were formed all together in one event. Multiple layers are bent and folded together, proving rapid burial events created them. We find trees spanning through multiple layers of rock, and all over the globe we find massive areas of erosion, such as great canyons carved out. It is obvious that God left all of this evidence behind as a testimony to the biblical flood.